Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, BRCGS Food Safety Standard Issue 9, Understanding the Revised Standard and What to Expect. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. LRQA will share a recording of the webinar with everyone who has registered in the next couple of days. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Any questions that we do not have time to answer during the session will be responded to you after the webinar. For your information, we will be running some live polls today. Please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. It is my pleasure to introduce your speakers for today, Richa Bedi Navik, Senior Global Standards Manager at BRCGS, and Mark Fincham, UK Technical Manager at LRQA. Richa is the technical expert and senior standards manager for global standard for food safety and START at BRCGS, where she is responsible for developing, maintaining the value and growth of both programs globally. During her 13-year career, Richa has worked in a variety of roles associated with food safety and quality management, including food manufacturing, food service, and retail sector, as well as the logistics industry. BRCGS is a leading brand and consumer protection organization used by over 30,000 certificated suppliers over 130 countries, with certification issued through a global network of accredited certification bodies. Mark has worked for LRQA for 30 years as a food assessor and technical manager. He has carried out assessments against both BRCGS and FSSC, whilst currently he manages the BRCGS standards globally and the delivery of all food safety standards in the UK and Ireland. Prior to joining LRQA, Mark worked in the meat, frozen food, canning, and bakery industry for a number of manufacturers, including Campbell's and Bird's Eye. I will now hand over to our first speaker, Richa.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome everyone to the session. Let me take you through some of the key changes in Food Issue 9. To begin with, let's just go quickly through the status review. So where does Food Issue 8 stand and will be until Food Issue 9 goes live in February 2023? Currently, we have 22,000 plus certificated sites within this program with a year-on-year growth rate of 5.3%. A presence in 126 countries, with top countries being Italy, UK, and closely followed by China. And there's 77 approved certification bodies for the food standard. Reviewing the timeline of Food Issue 9. So although the standard's gone live, along with the guideline and publication recently, as you would have seen, so the interpretation key changes, as well as some of the additional modules are live. But there's quite a bit of work that still needs to happen. So what does that mean? Our training programs. So approved training partners, training programs will be live from September 2022. The audited insight training courses, everything available online to be booked, but would run from October 2022. And the audits against Issue 9 would commence from 1st February 2023. This date is a hard cutoff. What that means is if your site audit starts or commences on 31st Jan, it would be against Issue 8. But any audit that commences on 1st Feb 2023, regardless of what time zone you are in, it would be in against the Issue 9 standard. Looking at the key influences for Food Issue 9, how did we go about developing the standard and what were some of the key factors that drove the thinking process. With every version of the standard, we do require and request a lot of feedback from the standard users like yourselves. So, be it manufacturers, retailers, certification bodies, auditors, everyone alike, based on their experience of the standard. So, feedback is collated based on issue weight. And additionally, there is feedback through various conferences as well and the inquiries. All of that is collated by the standard manager with that specific standard and is presented to the working group. The key themes that influenced issue 9 were identified and are in front of you on this slide. To begin with, there has been further clarity on product safety culture. As you guys have seen, we have strengthened the culture clause a little bit further, and we will cover this in a bit more detail later. Culture was first introduced in issue 8, and audits against them have highlighted there's been a significant impact on culture improvement on site. Absolutely, where it used to be within the first 10 non-conformances against this clause, it has definitely tailed down and it does not even make an appearance in the top 10. Therefore, what based on the way auditing against culture went about, it did highlight there was a need to take it a little bit further, and that's what we have done with issue 9. Additionally, as you would know, Codex General Principles, they have been updated, and that has influenced Section 2, and Section 2 has been strengthened. Benchmarking against the GFSI requirement did bring in quite a few of the standard updates. Namely, you would see animal primary conversion section, clauses moved about, as well as we have extended the scope of the standard to cover animal feed. Expanding the audit options, including ICT. So that in essence is the blended audit option that has been introduced within the standard and is currently available. It's GFSI benchmarks, so sites have the option to go into that. This was based on all the learnings we had from remote auditing during COVID era, essentially, but still sort of is partly ongoing in the world. But all the learnings and the good things that came out of remote auditing have been incorporated here. Core product safety cultures, core product safety activities. So the more we talk about core activities, food safety activities, the less it is. What this in essence means is your fundamental basics, food safety basics at a site, enhancing them. Things like internal audit, your traceability requirements, your root cause analysis, your validation verification. So all of this, they have been a key theme. So issue 9 has not been a major revamp, as you must have seen. It's more about the evolution around these key activities per se. And finally, as I've already mentioned, we've tried to provide further clarity for sites regarding animal primary conversion, and standard has extended its scope to cover animal feed. So as we were talking about scope, the main scope of the standard still primarily remains the same. We aim to cover the requirements for manufacturing, processing, and packing of processed food, raw material or ingredients, primary products, pet food as a base. But there is the additional added benefit for sites to consider traded goods within the scope. This still remains an additional warranty module. However, it is included within the standards, so provides the ease for sites to have this included on the certificate itself. However, if you don't really want to go with it, you still have the option to sign out of that. Additionally, where BRCGS tries to provide that relief in the audit burden, what we tend to develop is the additional warranty modules. Sites do not really need to go in for an additional audit to understand or check out these added segments onto the main food safety audit, but it's all incorporated into one. Currently, with the food standard, we offer three, namely Global Gap, Meat Supply Chain, and the FISMA module. And during the course of the standard, we might develop a few more, but it's all based on what the industry drive is, what the requirements are, and in case there's any additional need of the hour. And it does provide us with that flexibility, but it's primarily aimed at reducing that audit burden. So looking at the key changes to the requirements, what you have in front of you on the screen are primarily the main key areas that have changed, and we will be covering a few of those later on during the presentation, namely product safety culture. We'll talk about that a little bit more. HACCP, outsourced processing again. This section, we have provided a lot of clarity. New requirements added in, not just to strengthen, but even to explain what an outsourced process is, and if a site is actually undertaking outsourced processing or are outsourcing part of the process per se, then there are additional requirements to strengthen just to make sure that there's no loose ends as such. Root cause analysis, as I've mentioned, the standard base for, or the main key criteria for this update was around the evolution of your product safety core activities, and hence you would have seen clause have been revised. There's sort of better linkage of root cause analysis and continual improvement within various sections of the standard. Food defense, it's a very specific section. We have taken out site security requirements, and they have gone into your normal external on-site security as one, and food defense on its own. Equipment has undergone a major revamp based on various several industry and the standard guidelines that have been updated. Plus, there was a need to make sure there's quite a few other considerations and factors that had to be brought into this section, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. And finally, animal primary conversion. The key changes to protocol from issue 8 to 9, namely two, as you can see on the screen, blended audits and unannounced audits, but Mark's going to cover them in a lot more detail later on during the presentation. So we won't talk about this now, but just for your information, something to bear in mind and listen to Mark when he gets to them. So covering off the key changes to the requirement, let's start with food safety and quality culture. As I'd mentioned already, we were the first standard to introduce requirements for culture within the requirements, essentially within the standard. Issue 8 had the requirement to develop a plan. Considerations for behavior was something that really stood out based on how the audits against this clause were going. And if you see various definitions of culture, behavior is a term that generally is referenced and makes an appearance quite significantly over and over. Hence, the working group decided that we did need to consider that within the requirement. The site needs to consider them while developing the plan. Certain activities related to behavior would need to be incorporated. And a lot of explanation is gone into the interpretation guideline. If we look at what the requirements are, so how the clause has evolved from issue 8 to 9, we have provided a list of defined activities. Some of them, they are based around the GFSI benchmark requirement, but this requirement has gone over and above. This is just our way to make sure we stay up par and to understand the need of the hour and support the industry where it's needed. Most of them are fairly straightforward. So what you would have to do is still have a plan that defined activities around the 5 areas, your clear and open communication. You should have activities taking into consideration training. Feedback from employees is a key and definitely something that you do see mentioned and highlighted and picked up by the sites themselves as a criteria to improve on. What we mean by inclusion of behaviors, it's primarily just focusing on your product safety processes. So how is a site basically going about and making sure that if there is a food safety process per se, a very simple process, even as washing hands. So how would a staff member, when not being observed, would they actually wash their hands or not? And if that is something that the staff uh, are aware of, as well as the supervisors aware of, what are the various mechanisms that they might put in place to make an improvement? That potentially can go into your plan. And finally, your performance management on activities that are related to product safety, authenticity, legality, and quality. So you do develop a plan, activities are defined, they're measurable with intended timescales, and then you have a plan to review the effectiveness of these activities. So continuous improvement, as we said, is always the key, and reviewing the plan and its effectiveness started off as being one of the main reason for a non-conformance against food safety and quality culture clause, but has definitely trailed down. Sites have actually understood or started to understand what culture clauses are all about, and there's definitely massive improvements we've seen at our end from the audit reports and results point of view. Moving on to HACCP. As I said, it's basically codex have updated and reviewed their standards, so it's all incorporated, which has influenced quite a number of clauses within the standard. And if you meet the requirements of Section 2, you are compliant to the codex principles essentially per se, so legally covered. One thing to highlight, there has been a number of inquiries over the years, as well as we still see the same being mentioned, various geographies globally, various legislative requirements in certain places to use certain terminology or the technical jargon. We don't advise the sites to have multiple plans just per se to have the terminology factors taken into consideration. If the terminology, for example, in the US, if there's certain terminology that you need to use, but it meets the requirements section 2, we do not want you to have the same terminology that we use. It should not be an issue. Our auditors regionally, they are well versed with the legislative terminology as well as requirements, so they will be fully supportive of that. As a site, what you need to ensure is, though, you understand and make sure Section 2 requirements are fully met. So what are the key changes? As you would have seen by now, the review of HACCP is linked to Section 2.12. You validate your HACCP plan and you establish your verification processes. What that means, in essence, is this is just trying to take all your validation of food safety controls into consideration from a codex point of view. So any changes per se to your plan, they need to be identified, they need to be validated before the implementation of the plan. If you have an existing HACCP plan, the requirements under 2.12.2 and 2.12.3 should make sure you are compliant with the requirements of what we are saying in regards to a validated HACCP plan. But if you are developing a new HACCP plan, then 2.12.1 is the main clause that you need to consider. Coming on to outsourced processing. So we did try to define and make sure that outsourced processing covered all angles, avenues, and issue rate. However, not perfect still. And the feedback we got is there's quite a lot of confusion around outsourced processing. We have ensured, or we have tried, let's put it that way, we have tried to make sure that we do define this term a little bit better. So that's what you would see. New definition, we have taken contract packing out of the outsourced processing section. The intention behind that is just to make sure contract packing from the standard point of view falls under your services. So management of services is how you would see that operation, but your outsourced processing, and in case there is any happening at the site, then not exactly at the site, if you do intend on having an outsourced process, then there's further clarity, there's new requirements, and it needs to be built into your HACCP plan. So what does outsourced processing essentially mean? If you are intaking raw material onto the site needs to undertake some sort of a process, and then the process goes out to a different site completes that process, whatever per se, but then the product returns back. So they have done one step at the other site, comes back to the main site. Further processing is needed to fit into the definition of outsourced process, as can be seen in that lightly gray box. When the product comes back to site, you need to have an additional process. You might need to do some additional packaging onto it, but that additional processing step is what defines the outsourced process per se. You do that additional processing, it's still controlled outside. There's certain checks that are done, and then it goes out into distribution. What contract packing is essentially product doesn't is either not returned to site, or when it comes to site, there's no further checks per se done on the product. So you need to be very mindful about how and what the outsource process is. If you need any further clarification, please do drop us a note or have a discussion with the certification bodies, and we'll try to make sure that the clarity is provided. Coming on to equipment, as I mentioned already, we have tried to strengthen this section quite a bit based on not just the current industry best guideline practices, as well as there's quite a bit of detail and sort of certain legislative changes as well that come about in within this arena consideration, how the requirements have evolved. There's the new equipment or equipment that's new to site, so that takes into consideration as second-hand equipment, requirements for movable equipment. So what we mean by that, your equipment and design should be suitable for the operation that you are currently doing, and it should be fit hygienic design essentially per se of whatever equipment is in use. So equipment, when you purchase, there are requirements for new equipment. There's requirement essentially that covers the refurbished as well as second-hand equipment. There's new clauses on installation, as you would have seen, and there's new requirements for mobile and static equipment as well. Clauses as being the way with issue 8, still very prescriptive, tells you exactly what the requirement is. And just as a site, you do need to bear in mind when you are buying or bringing in new equipment onto site that there is consideration made. It's not just the new that you need to focus on, but second-hand and refurbished still need to meet the requirements of the standard. Finally, moving on to animal primary conversion. Well-defined term, fully identified within issue 8 as well. So this is more primarily the slaughter or gutting of fish or slaughter or evisceration of animal. So this is your red meat, poultry, and game. There's very specific controls, and this all has been driven by the GFSI benchmark requirement. What we intended on doing was either scatter the requirements to various sections or just have a new section. And the working group did think that putting it all into one section, very neat and clean. So if a site does it, they sign up to it. If not, then it can be paid out. Clauses are very closely linked to various other sections within the standard. And as I said, it was a choice whether we scatter them throughout the standard or just make a linkage and put it all neatly into one section. And that's how we've gone about it, that one needs section, you sign in or you sign out of it, but the requirements are fairly straightforward. And I think at this point, that's it, what I intend of covering today, and I hand over to Mark.
Hello. What I'm going to do is spend a bit about time talking about the actual audit process itself rather than the requirements of the standard. So I'll be spending some time looking at the timescales and preparing for the audit and talking about changes that are taking place in a bit more detail in the protocol. First of all, I'm going to start talking about changes to the protocol itself. The protocol is really in the standard the way that the audit is conducted. And the interesting thing about the main changes to the protocol are none of them are new, and they all go around the choice of audit that you can undertake. And really what the BRCGS Food 9 has done is incorporated the latest requirements into the standard itself. But interestingly enough, none of this should be new to you. There are three processes by which you can be audited, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about these three processes. I'm actually going to start with the middle one, which is the blended announced audit. This is something which has really come out of the COVID crisis and has been incorporated in business as usual. The blended audit, which can only take place on the announced audit, is partially on-site and partially remote audit. This is an option that you can take if you feel that this is best for yourself. The blended audit would start with a remote audit looking at the documentation in your system, and this will be done remotely with the auditor first checking the IT systems are adequate to conduct the audit. The second part of the audit is the on-site audit. This is where we go onto the site and look at the manufacturing operations and areas which really can't be adequately audited remotely. This way, it gives you a bit of the best of both worlds of allowing remote and on-site auditing, and it's an option that you can choose. This can be opted into at any point as long as you're on the announced scheme. The fully unannounced audit, that's the last box you can see there. This is the unannounced scheme where every single audit is unannounced. It is absolutely identical to the scheme which was in the BRCGS Food 8 standard and is an option that you can choose. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. The area which is worthy of talking about is the announced scheme. The announced scheme is the scheme, as you suggest, announced audits take place. But what it's doing is that the standards has incorporated the requirements of BRCGS 079 version 3. So this is the requirement coming out of the GFSI that if you're in the announced scheme, 1 in 3 audits in a 3-year cycle must be unannounced. The requirements are that the auditor will, over the 3-year cycle, one of the audits will be unannounced. The certification body will decide which of these audits is unannounced and will let you know, usually within 3 months of the completion of your previous audit. You can then block out up to 10 days when you don't want the audit to take place. This will be typically when you know that there's an outage in production, there's no production taking place, or there is a pre-arranged audit at that time. These can be communicated to the certification body, and we won't conduct the audit on these dates. The audit will then take place unannounced, typically 4 months prior to the due date of the audit. The auditor will turn up unannounced. In fact, the audit's completely planned. It's just we don't tell you when we're coming. But the auditor will turn up on the day planned and will conduct the audit unannounced. And hopefully, then the audit will go ahead in a straightforward manner. There are lots of requirements in BRCGS 079. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the details of them, but certainly we do get lots of questions around seasonal products. Seasonal products can be an issue at the best of times, particularly when harvest periods can change. And it's even more complicated if the audit's going to be unannounced. But I would say the key element of this is communication between yourselves and the certification body, just to make sure that we are aware when the harvest starts, so that we can actually try to plan the audit within the time when you're actually in processing. Another consideration is sometimes that the audit window might fall right at the end of the harvest period. So there's a good chance we might be coming in when you finish production. If we know when you're actually conducting the process, when the harvest is due, we can plan accordingly. Again, the details are within BRCGS 079, but I really would draw your attention that the key is communication in this case. If you let us know what's going on, we can actually plan our audits around what you do. And there is some leeway if the harvest takes place after the due date of bring the audit back without penalising you with a major non-compliance. Although this is true of the protocol anyway under seasonal products. But it's certainly, like all these things, it's communication, blackout days, so that we know when we can't come and audit you. What I would suggest is if you do have any questions, and it's quite a complicated area, that your first port of call is to look at BRCGS 079. This can be found on My BRCGS, and that answers a lot of the questions without necessarily having to contact us or the BRCGS. But if you do, then we will be able to help you with the finer details and complexities of this requirement. Next, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about timescales and preparation for BRCGS issue 9. As you've heard already, the standard itself is due for publication on the 1st of August. And as you've heard and understand that no audits will take place until the 1st of February 2023. This is giving a 6-month period by which we can prepare ourselves, train our auditors, you can prepare yourselves and set your system up to meet the requirements of the new standard. And this is very typical of all BRCGS standards, and there's no difference in this case. So putting it into simple terms, if your audit's due prior to the 1st of February, you're audited against issue 8. And if it's after the 1st of February, it's against issue 9. However, there may be a little bit of complexity and unknown when you come into the unannounced audit scheme. As I've discussed with the announced scheme and the 1 and 3 unannounced audit, then the audit window is a 4-month period when this audit can take place up to your due date. And if you're on the unannounced scheme, then there is in effect a 9-month window potentially when the audit could take place. Although again, even on the unannounced scheme, there is a window. So if you fall into the period of the sort of changeover and say, for instance, your due date is after the 1st of February, but you'll know that your next visit is unannounced, there's a very good chance that your audit will be prior to the 1st of February. And if that's the case, you'll be audited against issue 8 and receive an issue 8 standard. That being said, what I would strongly suggest is, irrespective of when your audit is due, I would plan and start implementing your systems to meet the requirements of issue 9 and be ready for issue 9, irrespective of if you fall into this slight period of uncertainty because of unannounced audits. By being ready for issue 9 doesn't mean to say you're necessarily going to be non-compliant with issue 8. So it is important to be prepared. Just a little bit of, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about best practice for food safety audits, audits in general, processes. And one thing you to do when looking at your processes and your controls is to think of them as processes, and all processes have inputs, they have an activity and they have an output. So if you're looking at your controls, and particularly in the new areas, if there's new areas that you need to look at putting your controls in place, always to think, what are the inputs to any particular process or activity you're looking at? What are the particular controls? These could be sort of HACCP, PRPs, procedures, and also what resources do you need to actually conduct these audits? To then get the output and the desired outcomes, then you've got to make sure that these controls are in place or adequate. So if you are looking at updating your systems or bringing new requirements in, just think about the process approach, and this will actually allow you to easily define the controls and activities you need to do. This slide is equivalent or is equally applicable to any type of process, but food safety is what we're looking at today. One thing that we're talking about and worth pointing out is that, as well as this webinar, LRQA can help you in your journey for implementation of BRCGS issue 9. For instance, we can offer training and briefing workshop, and these can be quite bespoke if you require it. The obvious thing that we can provide is, if you're in doubt about your level of compliance, why not book a gap analysis? An auditor will come on site and they will audit your system against the requirements of issue 9, and if there are any gaps, we will report them. It's quite a nice way to actually give you the assurance that you're ready to be audited the new version of the standard. We can get involved in developing culture, service and support, going back to this development we're seeing with the new standard with quality and food safety culture. And again, on a more general point, control of suppliers is always important, and we can, if you so wish, provide support and activity doing second-party audits on your supply chain. That's not a BRCGS issue 9 point. It's something we can do anyway. We're auditors and we can help you in your sort of supply chain assurance programs. Another area which is less connected to food safety but worthy of mention is that we can provide support through audit of your sustainability requirements. It's becoming quite a big buzzword within the food industry at this moment, and an area which is always of concern, and it's something that we can do specific audits on cybersecurity, and this is a non-food product, but it's an issue which is as relevant to the food industry as it to any other industry. So just bear in mind that we can provide services in these areas. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. And now I think we're going to ask you a few poll questions. So I'll pass you back at this point.
Right. Thank you, Richa and Mark. We're now going to move to our 4 poll questions for today. Just a reminder that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. So our first poll question is, will your company be seeking food safety training in the next 12 months? Let me put this up for you. All right, you should be able to send in your answers. Please select one of the following options. Yes, food safety issue 8 to 9, conversion for sites training. Number 2, yes, food safety issue 8 to 9, conversion for auditors training. Number 3, yes, we will seek training other than conversion from issue 8 to 9. And number 4, no, we won't seek training. So please do send in your answers. We'll just leave this up for a few more seconds to allow you to vote. Perfect, thank you all. We will close this poll and we'll move to the next one. And the next one is, will your organization be looking for any of the following services in the next 12 months? And we will allow you to vote in just a couple of seconds. Here you go. You should be able to see the poll on the screen. And you have the option here to select all that apply from the following options. BRCGS food safety transition from issue 8 to issue 9, BRCGS food safety certification, gap analysis, cybersecurity, sustainability services. So please select all answers that apply. Just a few more seconds for you to vote. Thank you very much. We'll close this poll. And we will move to the next one. Okay, so thank you for your responses so far. This is our third poll, and the question is, will your organization be looking for certification in the following areas in the next 12 months? And we will launch the poll for you. 2 seconds. Here it is. You should now be able to send in your answers. And you have 4 options here: BRCGS packaging materials, BRCGS ethical trade and responsible sourcing, BRCGS consumer products, BRCGS storage and distribution. So please select one of these answers. And we will be sharing the results of this poll with you in just a few moments. I can see your answers coming in, so thank you very much for sending in your input. A few more seconds. So will your organization be looking for a certification in the following areas in the next 12 months? And you have 4 options there on the screen. All right, I'm going to close this poll and I'm going to also share the results with you. So you should be able to see the results on the screen in just a few seconds. Okay, so we have 13% have answered BRCGS packaging materials, 12% BRCGS ethical trade and responsible sourcing, 58% BRCGS consumer products, and 17% BRCGS storage and distribution. Mark or Richa, if you'd like to comment on these results, please feel free to do so. Please unmute to be able to.
Yes, I'd just like to comment. 12% BRCG ethical trade and responsible sourcing is interesting because that is a new standard that BRCGS have published in the last couple of years. So that's quite interesting and quite a high score considering it's a new standard, it is interesting.
Absolutely, and just to add to that, for the attendees on the call, within the service package, you have a free ethical trade and responsible source risk assessment, which is a tool freely available to all sites, whether you are within the food standard, storage, distribution, packaging, consumer products. Everyone can make use of the ethical risk assessment. So please do feel free to explore that. More information is available on our website. So that's brcgs.com.
That's great. Thank you, Richa and Mark. And now let's move to the last poll. And you will be able to see it on the screen in just a few seconds. Okay, and the question is, excluding food safety, what other areas within the food industry are of concern to your business? And the options here are sustainable food, ethical trade and responsible sourcing, food traceability, labeling, and supply chain risk. So if you'd like to please select one of these answers. We will give you about 1 minute to vote. And we will be sharing the results of this poll as well. Okay, we are ready to close this poll, and I'll be sharing the results as well. So you should be able to see them on the screen. We have 14% of attendees picked sustainable food, 13% ethical trade and responsible sourcing, 28% food traceability, 15% labeling, 31% supply chain and risk. Again, Richa and Mark, please feel free to unmute and comment if you'd like to. You are muted. No comment on this one. Or perhaps?
It is, again, not surprising, I would have thought, with my comment, the poll results, to be honest. Food traceability obviously is a very key one. That's top of the, well, second, again, supply chain risk, which is clearly not surprisingly at the top. So no, I think there's no surprises to me in that poll at all, really. I don't know what you think, Rita.
No, same. I think I'll just echo your thoughts here. And yeah, nothing more to add. I think you've covered it perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you to our attendees for participating in these polls. So Mark and Richa, we're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel in the menu on the right-hand side of the screen. So Mark, Richa, please feel free to turn on your webcams if you'd like to. Please remember to unmute as well. Perfect. And I will let you to read out and answer the most relevant questions from our attendees.
I will start. First of all, as you can imagine, there's quite a large number of attendees at this webinar, so there's not a chance that we'll be able to answer every single question here in the time we've got. So we'll be selecting certain questions, but we'll get around to answering all the questions in the fullness of time. A regular question first asked, I want to share this webinar with my team. Will there be a recording available at various questions of the same type? The answer is yes, there will be a recording available, and this will be available on the LRQA website, that's lrqa.com website, after this webinar. So yes, that will be available to everybody. So yes, you can access it and download it. Okay, we'll alternate our answering of questions. So if I hand over to Risha, she'll answer some questions that then we'll alternate backwards and forwards with certain questions.
Thank you, Mark. I'll start off with a very basic one that I've noticed a theme within the Q&A chat, and it's just around where can you download, or whether can you download a copy of the standard interpretation guideline and key changes, and whether it's available along with the checklist. So starting off, standard as well as the interpretation guideline can be downloaded from BRCGS Participate. So if you are an existing site within the BRCGS program, then yes, you can download it for free, although it's not a printable version. So if you would like to get a printable version, you would have to purchase that through the store, BRCGS store. In regards to the checklist is usually available on BRCGS Participate and as well as the website. And as I was told, both of these the places this document is live on BRCGS website. You will find it under the standards. So go onto food safety, and under the help and guidance section is where you would find the checklist for version 8 as well as issue 9. So both the documents are there. But if you have any challenges, please do drop us a note on inquiries@brcgs.com, and we will be able to help you just navigate and find these documents for you. So over to you, Mark.
Okay, well, I've got quite a lot of questions relating to the protocol changes in the unannounced scheme and the timescales. So This is an example, which is quite a good example of a question on the changeover. I'll just read it out. In case the certification site due date on December 2022 would assess the recertification against the BRCGS Food 8. Next, the site would want an extension for a different scope in April. What standard, I'm paraphrasing it, it's quite a long question, what standard would the extension of scope be against? This is the same really for all BRC standards and changeover standards. If you have an audit prior to the changeover date against issue 8 and you then want to change a scope visit, then the change of scope visit will be against your existing certificate because we're changing the scope on the existing certificate. So if your audit was and your certificate was issue 8, it then still be issue 8 that we do the extension against, even if it's after the changeover date in February. So yeah, you're always extending the current certificate or changing the current certificate, whatever that may be. Okay, I'll just pass back to Risha. Yeah.
Okay, so then rather than taking questions, what I would do is just focus on the themes of what sort of questions are coming about. And the next one I can talk about is the food safety and quality culture. So there's a number of various ways people have asked some further clarity on this section. So to begin with, the intention with the culture clause stays the same. The intent is not for the auditors to go on site and audit the site's culture. So where we've gone in with the additional requirement or site having activities related to improving product safety behaviors, so the auditor is not really there to audit the behaviors. So the intention is still where fairly straightforward. They will focus on your plan. So whatever goes in within your product, your food safety and quality culture plan is what the auditors are there to audit. And the improvement is based purely on what your findings are. What are the activities you as a site would like to focus to identify and understand what those activities actually could be, or the areas where the site really needs to develop. You can use, there's a number of tools. It's not just the product safety culture module that BRCGS has on their website. There's a number of other tools out in the market, as well as there's training courses, but we do not really specify anything for the site. It's entirely up to you what you go ahead with. But yes, the food safety culture module on BRCGS website is one of them. And Mark, if you would like to add anything to it, please feel free. But then it's
I will do, thanks. No, I think that was very clear, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Again, just another question about the audits against version 9. There's a question here, and there's been one or two similar questions. Can you request to be audited against version 9 if your audit window is before February 2023? The answer is no. The changeover is a hard changeover on the 1st of February. If your window is prior to that, then you'll be audited against BRCGS version 8, issue 8. And if you're due after, or the audit is planned after the 1st of February, it will be against issue 9. There was another similar question, which is asking the same question about if we were audited against issue 8 and then issue 9 comes in, do we need to make a transition to issue 9? The answer is no. It's not that the issue 8 standard will become expired, cease to exist after the 1st of February, because as you're aware, there is a period when if you're audited between now and February, you'll have a certificate to issue 8. That certificate to issue 8 is valid until your next audit is due. So it's not a case that there is a cut-off point of expiry of the certificate or the issue of the certificate. As obviously, if your certificate is issue 8 and it goes past the expiry date on your certificate, you're not certified anymore. And if you had a re-audit, it would be against issue 9. But no, BRC Food 8, BRCGS Food 8, suddenly doesn't become expired after the 1st of February. So again, there's 1 or 2 questions on that. So rest assured, it doesn't matter which standard you audit against, they are valid standards. It's just the issue 9 is the updated version of it. It's no more valid than the current issue 8. I think that's true, Risha. Yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely spot on. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would do is actually just take you through the sections now. So wherever we've had questions on section 2, so primarily around changes to HACCP, and there's still a number of questions focusing on terminology use. All I would say is terminology-wise, our auditors are regional, well-versed with the legislative requirements within the regions they operate in. So you do not need to worry about the terminology usage. All you have to do is make sure you are compliant to section 2 of the standard. So if you do present us with compliance criteria against a different standard, a different certification program, a different version altogether, that would not be acceptable. What we are looking for is compliance to section 2 of the BRCGS food safety standard. So focus on that element, use whatever terminology is completely acceptable. The other question being asked is which version of Codex. So it is the latest version that was updated in 2020 is the one that food issue 9 is compliant to. So if you meet the requirements of section 2 of food safety issue 9, then you are compliant to the Codex requirements as well. And Mark, is there anything you would like to add? Otherwise, over to you.
No, that's fine. That's great. I've got a question here, which is an interesting question, and it's probably worthy of talking about before I start moving into the quite a large number of questions relating to the blended and unannounced scheme. But I think this is a good question to cover. How is auditor training being carried out to ensure that CBs are up to date before January? I think you mean February, but I am especially interested in Vietnam, how I can verify this. The way the process works, and this is universal across the globe for all CBs, is that the BRCGS up to about October will be developing awareness training for both organizations and auditors. There is a difference in the course between the auditor awareness training and transition and the site version of it. The training is carried out by BRCGS ATPs, approved training providers, and they go through a train-the-trainer course, which has been organised to run, I think, in around about October. So from October through to February, all certification bodies will be organising transition training for their auditors, which is BRCGS training. So it's the same training given to every single auditor worldwide, using trainers who have been trained by the BRCGS themselves. So there's consistency in their approach. All auditors who are currently registered with the BRCGS on their directory need to undertake this transition training, and only when they pass will they be allowed to conduct audits against a new version of the standard. Because BRCGS have an oversight of the auditor training and who's been trained and who hasn't been trained, no auditor can perform an audit unless they have gone through this transition training. So it's a guarantee that the auditor you will get will have gone through exactly the same training as every single other auditor in the world. So there should be a consistency of approach and a consistency of interpretation of the new version of the standard. Risha, I think I've got everything there, I think, yeah.
Yes, yeah, you did. The only thing to add is, so the very first, the process begins with the principal train the trainer session. And we have completed the principal trainer session, but that doesn't mean anything for anyone on the call. So it is just as Mark said, for consistency purposes, we ensure we train out the first set of the trainers, and then that same training content as well as the techniques are disseminated out, and every single one of you who attends a BRCGS course, the exact same course content is presented to you, as Mark said. So yeah, absolutely spot on then. Okay, moving on to section 3 then, and talking a little bit about root cause analysis as well, because I did see there's quite a few questions that were revolving around that theme. Just to clarify, the intent hasn't changed. What you would notice within issue 9 is we have worked out a number of cross linkages, as we call it. So there's a lot more clarity, and as well as you can take them as reminders that when you go to a specific clause and there is an expectation that you do explore or go into the detail a little bit further, is where you would see a cross link to have you done your corrective action, or this section potentially consider your corrective actions, look at the root cause analysis. Does not necessarily mean that we are asking for a root cause analysis for every single complaint. The intention hasn't changed. All we've done with this version, and as I said at the beginning of the webinar, it is all about evolution. This standard is not a major revamp. We have not introduced any main themes. All we have done is where a site might pick up the standard with an intent to just comply to the standard, what we are trying to do is educate the industry a little bit and make sure that you are making the most out of having a standard implemented. It's not just implement the clauses, but actually it helps you improve your food safety processes. And that is the intention, and that is what is being echoed with the cross linkages. So there's a lot of reference, a lot of reminders just for sites, and partly it is based on the analysis of non-conformances that we see. So every audit that the auditors conduct, we are at the receiving end of the non-conformances, as well as there's a lot of root cause analysis data. And looking at the root cause analysis data, it is abundantly clear that there's still a lot of understanding that the industry can do with. And hence, what you would notice is with a number of Food 9 presentations that BRCGS are conducting this year, and anywhere we speak, we will be focusing a lot on root cause analysis, internal audits, validation, verification being another big theme. And yeah, that was again covered, or a question asked about validation, verification of your existing as well as new HACCP plans. With the existing HACCP plans, all we would say is you would have a number of processes in place. So please do ensure that if you meet the requirements of 2.12.2 and 2.12.3, that would help you guide in regards to how can you meet the validation, the new validation requirement that Codex has implemented. And if you are a new site, then 2.12.1 would take you through the entire process. But the additional validation definitely needs to be done for existing plans as well as new plans. And back to you, Mark.
Okay, well, I'll start answering some questions on the announced, unannounced 1 in 3 scheme. I'll try to group a few of them together. There's been a number of questions on the planning part. One question asked, typically in the past, they've been invited by the CB to select which sites are going to go be an unannounced, and what dates, what year those unannounced audits are going to take place. My understanding of the protocol is that it's the certification body who decides the site and the date, which point in the 3-year cycle this audit is going to take place, and it's not the site and it's not the auditor. So that's one question. Another question was around the start date for this 4-month window. The question really was that, is it taken from the due date from, or the due date to the last date, or the start date of that 28-day window? The simple answer is that from the announced schemes, we're actually moving to one due date. That's the final due date. So certificates, and you'll see them coming up quite recently because we've changed in the last couple of weeks to this already. There'll only, for an announced scheme, there'll only be one date, only one due date. So it will be typically 4 months prior to that due date. So it's the due date to the last date. There's a question on blackout days, which are blockout days, which is very similar. Are 10 dates blockout days able to be changed? The answer is depends. If we contact you within 3 months of the last audit date, you send in your 10 block dates and you change those in the quite a distance in the future, then it won't be a problem. If we're getting in towards the last few weeks before the unannounced audit window, and you change blocked out days within that unannounced window, there's a chance that we can't change those dates. To put it into context and to be truthful, the only difference between an unannounced audit and an announced audit is that we don't tell you when we're turning up. We plan it in exactly the same way. Audit resource is a scarce commodity, and we plan audits a long way in advance. If we can address changes in blockout days or blackout days, we will do so. But the closer you get to the audit window and the due date, the chances of us being able to accommodate changes is not particularly high. So there's a chance that you might want to block out a date which is already planned for the audit. I hope that gives some clarification. So it's like all these questions, it depends. We try to be as accommodating as we possibly can. The last question on this point, and it's a similar type of question. There's a question saying, how do we communicate to the certification body on blockout days and starts of harvest time and other matters when this is our first initial audit? If you're on the announced scheme and it's your first audit, then your first audit won't be unannounced. We wouldn't do an initial audit unannounced first time on site. Another question which came along, and it's similar, is when is this starting? It started 2 years ago. We're almost into a third year of the unannounced scheme. It's been problematic introducing this 1 in 3 audit scheme for the simple reason that for the first 2 years we couldn't conduct unannounced audits because of the COVID-19. So unfortunately, you'll find that a lot of the unannounced audits are going to be concertinaed into the last part of the 3-year period, and that's not a consequence of planning on the certification body's part. It's necessity brought on by COVID-19. I've got lots of other questions. I think we're starting to run a bit short of time. I'm sure I'll get an indication when we're having to stop answering questions.
Thank you, Mark. That will be our last question, if that's okay. Thank you so much. We've run over a bit. Thank you.
Okay, yes, I heard we'd run over. So there are, I don't know, there's 50, 60 odd questions left unanswered, which we have to work our way through. So my apologies if we couldn't get around to all your questions. We will be looking at those and providing an answer in written form in due course. Okay, I'll pass you back, and thank you very much for your time in attending this webinar. I do hope you find it extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
Please. Thank you very much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking both Richa and Mark for the excellent webinar they delivered today. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.